Hello, and welcome to In Pursuit of Truth and Happiness, Episode 2, The Iliad and Historical Interpretation, Part 1. Previously, I discussed the methodology of my interpretation as well as the interpretive questions I will be asking as I analyze the books I will be covering in this podcast, beginning with the Iliad. The idea behind my interpretation is to draw out the strands of thought that comment upon the universal truths we seek to understand: God, evil, good, truth, love, and happiness, among other ideas. Moreover, it should be understood that Homer's understanding of first principles, for example, may not exactly be my own, or may they be yours. But the idea behind my analysis is to attempt to peer into, as best I can, into the mind of Homer, and for Homer to instruct me in all he knows. Only when I have attempted to fully understand, to the best of my abilities, what the author says, do I then have a discussion on what I agree or disagree with, assuming my disagreements and disagreements fall on the relatively demonstrable side versus disagreeing or agreeing without a solid, rational, and yet still faith-informed foundation. For first principles, as we recall from my previous episode, are not absolutely demonstrable. Let us now begin this episode. Anyone interested in the history of the Trojan War, or rather the archaeological side of the Trojan War, should check out the documentary In Search of the Trojan War by Michael Wood. I will say only that there is enough archaeological and historical evidence, although the latter is admittedly scant and open to interpretation, to confirm the Trojan War happened. It should also be noted that the Trojan War is taken for granted by the historians Herodotus and Thucydides, although the latter does approach the Homeric epic with skepticism, at least as regards the details of the conflict and not so much the conflict itself. What is interesting about the Iliad is not the accuracy and historical details of the Trojan War, but in presenting history with a precise understanding of the tragic cycle of war, the philosophical problem that leads to the tragic cycle of war, the pattern of war that is to be followed by every war in history, and noting the all too well-known perceptible changes in the fortunes of war. In other words, one way to read the Iliad is to read the Iliad as a lesson into that most tragic staple of the human condition of suffering: war. In approaching what the Iliad has to teach about war, we must understand the pattern of war, because not only is this fundamental to the story, but to all human history. The pattern the Iliad lays out is such: a prosperous civilization finds itself victim to an outside group through military conquest, where the prosperous civilization meets its fate at the hands of the conqueror that exudes a bloody vengeance and plunder that is described by Hector's wife and widow by the time she makes this set speech in Book 24 of the Iliad. In this case, not only Andromache foretells the fate of Troy, pointed to already by the death of its chief defender, Hector, but Homer, through Andromache, unfurls for readers and for all history what exactly awaits the fate of those doomed to be on the losing side of a battle or war. This devastation is reminiscent to the fates of civilizations once prosperous that sometimes find an end to their prosperity by war. Such a fate is not dissimilar to what we see happen in Greece in the Peloponnesian War, or Italy in the Byzantine reconquest during the reign of the Emperor Justinian, where the city of Rome is depopulated as a partial and direct consequence of the Byzantine reconquest of Italy. Historical examples abound, but the importance here to make note of is the pattern of war's devastation. Another pattern of war the Iliad captures is the change in fortunes that are ever so present in all wars in history. The Iliad presents us with quite a few battles, and in these battles we see one side winning with the other side losing, and suddenly the side that was losing is now winning. Whenever this change in the fortunes of battle happens, it is usually the work of a god causing havoc to the enemy or inspiring the troops in some way. This explanation may appear to be superstitious or simply a byproduct of Homer's time, but to take either of these interpretive approaches does more damage to the objective message of the Iliad than good, and thus from this perspective, is not as superstitious as at first may appear. Moreover, besides superstition or taking a relativist approach to religion, it is tempting to dismiss divine intervention because this seems to ignore other factors that contribute to victory in battle, such as the brilliant use of terrain and battle tactics, among others. But these technical parts of war do not account for that internal force of every army that manifests itself in a soldier's decisions to keep fighting or run away. That internal force not only shapes soldiers' behavior, but can snatch victory from the jaws of defeat and make defeat the outcome where victory seems certain. That internal force is morale. Sometimes morale is easy to account for, and sometimes not. Julius Caesar wins the Battle of Pharsalus because of brilliant tactics in part. But why did the soldiers of Pompey, who outnumbered Caesar's soldiers in number and domination of the terrain, not rally and fight harder, especially in the certain knowledge of the aforementioned advantages? In the Robert Fagel's translation of the Iliad, Bernard Knox draws an apt comparison between the role of Joan of Arc in the 100 Years' War and the intervention of the gods in the Iliad. Notably, it is pointed out how historians in the 21st century still cannot account for how Joan of Arc was able to inspire an army that had been defeated countless times to turn the fortunes of war against the hitherto victorious English. Joan of Arc's contemporaries could no more come to a unanimous consensus of interpreting the source of her actions than historians in the 21st century can. But no one doubts the impact on French morale, who subsequently win the 100 Years' War in 1453. First principle arguments, such as taking God or the Olympian gods as the determiners of the outcome of battle, speak only to how the interpreter understands the universe and the human relation to the universe. All human beings operate off first principle arguments, which are our presumptions, our articles of faith, that are our articles of faith on the big questions of divinity, human suffering, the problem of evil, and the nature of the universe. Taking this point of view, that our intellect takes as our understanding from the departure point of first principles, renders an explanation, such as God using St. Michael to direct Joan of Arc in the 100 Years' War, or the Olympian gods perpetuating the Trojan War, on account of the Olympian gods' endless scheming against each other, or on account of enacting an arbitrary and cruel punishment on a group of people due to the insult one man paid to the vanity of Hera and Athena, seem no more unreasonable than making the presumption that the Trojan War was fought over control of the Aegean, or was but a conflict, part of a greater conflict between the Greeks and the Hittites. First principle arguments by nature are only relatively demonstrable after all. Moreover, any explanation that touches upon the realm of religion will fall under the overall category of purpose rather than the overall category of science, which attempts to answer the question, how? The last point to cover on the topic of the Iliad's impact on helping us understand war is the Iliad's commentary on war as being caused by, in support of the Olympian gods perpetuating the conflict, mankind's philosophical approach to himself and the approach to others from this initial approach to the self, and how these two approaches are shaped by a certain attitude toward divinity and the merit of virtue or the lack thereof, including the lack of merit for suffering for virtue. However, I aim to keep these episodes within a 10-minute range. I will therefore post next week the second half to this introductory episode on the Iliad and historical interpretation, where I will discuss how the opening of the Iliad provides us with the philosophical foundation of all wars and conflicts in history, from the Trojan War to one-on-one conflicts and regular, everyday circumstances in life. Thank you for listening to this episode of In Pursuit of Truth and Happiness.